The first thing she remembered was the sound. Not the barking of guards, not the rattle of chains, but water. Hot water. It hissed behind the wooden doors like something alive, something forbidden. For months, they had been told what awaited them on the other side of capture. Humiliation, hunger, punishment. The Americans, her sergeant had whispered, will strip you, brand you, make you regret surrender. So when the doors swung open and steam rolled out, thick and fragrant with soap and something floral, Lucia froze. There, in a tiled room gleaming under electric light, rows of shower heads shimmered like silver vines. An American nurse, bare arms, calm eyes, handed her a small bottle. She didn't understand the label, only the smell. Clean, rich, unreal. Shampoo. Lucia hesitated. Around her, the other women stood still, clutching their clothes, their fear heavier than their hunger. One of them, a farmer's daughter from Naples, crossed herself and whispered, "They are mocking us." But the nurse simply nodded as if to say, "It's all right." The water came first as a shock, then as warmth. Dirt, ash, and weeks of terror slid away in ribbons down the drain. Some began to cry silently. Lucia reached up, touched her hair, and watched the foam turn gray. For the first time since capture, she felt her body again, her skin, her breath, her pulse. When they stepped out, towels waited. Real towels, thick as blankets. A table of bread and milk stood by the wall. The guards outside didn't shout. They just looked away, letting the women move freely. Lucia's hands trembled. This wasn't mercy, she thought. It had to be a trick, some new form of cruelty she couldn't yet see. But that was just the beginning. The morning after, they were led outside the barracks. The sun cut across the gravel yard, clean and sharp, as if the air itself had been washed. Lucia squinted. Her eyes had forgotten brightness. Beyond the barbed wire, the camp spread out like a small town, orderly, humming, almost beautiful. Wooden fences, laundry lines, a radio somewhere playing Glenn Miller. Trucks rumbled past carrying crates of bread and tins of butter, not soldiers. The smell of yeast drifted through the air. Lucia's friend, Julia, stared at a soldier crouched beside one of the vehicles. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was fixing a flat tire, humming to himself. His uniform was spotless. His hands were clean. He looked up, met her eyes, and smiled. No cruelty. No anger. Just a simple, almost embarrassed kindness. That smile unsettled them more than any threat could. In Mussolini's Italy, they had been told Americans were beasts, lazy, corrupt, soulless. Yet here, in the heart of captivity, these enemies built flower beds along the fences. Painted signs marked women's quarters and mess hall. Even the dogs wore collars with names. When the lunch bell rang, Lucia saw something that made her stop breathing. The guards and the prisoners ate together, at separate tables, yes, but under the same roof with the same bread, the same soup, the same spoons. She whispered, "It's impossible." Julia answered, "Then maybe everything else we believed was too." A sergeant passed by, tipping his cap like a waiter in a cafe. The women froze, unsure whether to salute or hide. The man chuckled softly, "You're safe here, ladies." His accent was strange, his words stranger still. Safe. Lucia looked around the camp again. Electric lamps stood tall along the fences, glowing even in daylight. Power that never slept. Civilization that didn't stop for war. For the first time, a thought surfaced that she couldn't silence. If this was how America treated its prisoners, what did their cities look like? Something far more disorienting was waiting beyond that fence, and soon they'd be taken there. They thought the camp was the edge of America. It wasn't. A week later, trucks rolled in before dawn. "You're moving," the interpreter said. No explanation, just the sound of diesel engines and a long road unspooling ahead. Lucia climbed aboard with 20 others, wrapped in her government-issued blanket, the stars fading over a horizon she didn't recognize. Hours passed. The landscape opened, fields, towns, telephone lines that ran straight to infinity. Everything looked organized. Even the silence had structure. Then came the smell: metal, oil, smoke. A shipyard. They stopped at a place called Richmond, California. The women were told to wait by a railing overlooking the harbor. Below, hundreds of men and women in denim and headscarves swarmed around something enormous. A gray hull rising from the water like a mountain. Sparks flew, hammers clanged, cranes turned in perfect rhythm. Lucia gripped the fence. "Is that one ship?" An American guard nodded. "Liberty ship, built in 4 days." 4 days. She thought she misheard. Back home, Italy's best yards took months to finish a single freighter. Here, workers moved with the precision of a clock, day and night, under lights brighter than the sun. One woman muttered, "They can't all know what they're doing." But they did. A foreman shouted numbers. Welders answered with gestures. Conveyor belts carried entire walls of steel. No one barked orders. No one panicked. Every motion looked rehearsed. Lucia felt something collapse inside her, a quiet, private defeat. They had been told American abundance was a lie, that industry built on greed must crumble under pressure. Yet here was proof otherwise, a nation that treated speed like faith, efficiency like art. As the ship slid into the bay to a chorus of horns and cheers, the women flinched. It felt less like industry, more like resurrection. Even Julia whispered, "How do you fight a country that builds like that?" Lucia didn't answer. She was still staring at the welders, at their faces glowing in the shower of sparks, faces of women, too. That image would haunt her, but the true shock was still waiting inside the shipyard cafeteria, where the smell of hamburgers and coffee mixed with laughter that no prisoner could yet understand. The cafeteria smelled like nothing they had ever known. Sweet, smoky, alive. Bacon, coffee, and something richer that clung to the air like a promise. Lucia stood in the doorway, staring at a room filled with laughter. Hundreds of workers, men and women, all wearing the same blue denim, were sitting shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables. Steam rose from trays piled with food. Golden bread, thick beef patties, bright red bottles of ketchup lined up like ammunition. A young American woman behind the counter held up a bun and asked, "Hamburger?" Lucia blinked, unsure what to answer. She had seen meat only as gray stew in the army camps, never stacked between 2 halves of soft bread. When the plate landed in her hands, she almost dropped it. The bun was warm. The smell, pure butter and salt, cut straight through months of fear. Julia took a cautious bite, then froze. Her eyes widened. "Dio mio, it's good." The women nearby laughed nervously. Some mimicked the way Americans ate, hands instead of utensils, mouths full but smiling. On the far wall, a vending machine glowed like something from the future. A soldier pressed a button and out came a glass bottle. Coca-Cola. He popped the cap and foam spilled over, hissing like victory itself. Lucia watched the bubbles rise and fall, hypnotized. Back home, sugar was rationed, coffee a memory, butter a dream. Yet here, even the prisoners could taste America's excess. And what confused them most wasn't the food, it was the mood. These people weren't celebrating victory or mocking defeat. They were casual, cheerful, unburdened by war. Lucia whispered, "They feed us like guests." Julia shook her head, still chewing. "No, like equals." Outside, a radio played swing music. Someone began tapping their foot. For a moment, the war felt very far away. But as Lucia lifted her eyes to the window and saw the Liberty ship sliding out to sea, she realized something chilling. This abundance was not luck. It was power, and the next shock would show just how deep that power ran. The train waited at the platform like a creature of steel and grace. Lucia had seen trains before, soot-black engines that coughed smoke and ash across starving towns. But this one gleamed under morning light, its brass polished, its windows clean enough to mirror the sky. On its side, painted letters, Pullman. The guards gestured for the women to board. No shouting, no dogs, just calm efficiency. Inside, Lucia froze. Plush seats, carpets, curtains. It felt like stepping into a hotel, not a prison transport. The air smelled faintly of soap and coffee, not diesel. Julia ran her hand along the fabric of the seats, whispering, "My father never rode anything like this." Across the aisle, a woman laughed nervously. "They'll take it away once we sit down," she said, but they didn't. A conductor, a real one, with a cap and polished shoes, walked through, punching tickets that didn't exist. Lucia's eyes drifted to the window. The train began to move, gliding rather than clattering. Outside, green fields and telephone lines blurred past. Every few minutes, the whistle cried out like a song of another world. Half an hour later, a porter appeared, a young black man in a crisp white jacket. He smiled. "Coffee, ma'am?" The women looked at each other, unsure if it was a test. Lucia nodded hesitantly. The cup trembled in her hand. The taste was strong, sweet, real. She closed her eyes, feeling the heat travel through her chest, thawing something long frozen. No one spoke for a while. The rhythm of the train did the talking. They were prisoners, yes, but the illusion was dangerous. It felt too human, too kind. When they stopped at a small station, Lucia noticed another train beside theirs, its cars filled with soldiers headed east. The men waved through the windows. Some threw candy. A few shouted, "Welcome to America!" She wanted to hate them, truly. But hatred needed fuel, hunger, pain, despair. And America was slowly taking those away, one warm meal, one hot shower, one smile at a time. As the train rolled on toward a city skyline shimmering in the distance, Lucia pressed her forehead against the glass. The reflection staring back at her didn't look like a soldier anymore. And somewhere in that reflection, a new question surfaced. If the enemy treated her this way, what did that make her own country? But the journey wasn't over yet. What awaited them in that city would challenge not just their pride, but their entire belief in what civilization meant. The city rose ahead like a mirage, smokestacks, cranes, glass windows glittering in the noon light. Lucia expected the smell of war, rot, metal, burned oil. Instead, she smelled disinfectant, clean floors, hospitals. The truck stopped in front of a white building crowned with a red cross. Nurses in pressed uniforms moved briskly in and out, their faces hidden behind masks, their gestures calm, practiced. Lucia frowned. A hospital? For us? Inside, everything gleamed. The corridors smelled of iodine and soap. The lights hummed softly overhead, steady, unblinking. A nurse gestured toward a row of benches. "Medical check," she said, slow and kind, as if talking to frightened children. Lucia's turn came. A doctor with silver hair and soft eyes motioned her closer. "Name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Lucia Bianchi, prisoner of war." He wrote it down neatly, then pointed to a large machine behind him. "X-ray." She stared at it, a strange contraption of metal arms and humming glass. Back home, such machines were legends. Even the wounded soldiers in Rome had to wait weeks for simple bandages. The doctor guided her under the device. The machine buzzed. A faint warmth spread through her chest. Seconds later, he pinned a glowing film to the wall, her ribs, her lungs, her heart, floating like a ghost inside light. Lucia stepped back, whispering, "That's..." Me. The doctor smiled. No broken bones. You're strong. In the next room, Julia watched a nurse unwrap a vial of penicillin. It's new, the nurse said, preparing an injection. Made just a few years ago, keeps infection away. She paused, searching for words. You're safe now. The needle went in. Julia's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but disbelief. They were giving her medicine, real medicine, for enemies. Outside, Lucia stood by the window, watching an ambulance roll in. Inside were American soldiers, yes, but also 2 German POWs. The nurses didn't seem to care who was who. Everyone was treated, one after another, with the same measured grace. She whispered to herself, "How can they do this?" There was no answer, only the sound of typewriters and soft shoes across linoleum floors. When she looked up, she saw a sign painted above the exit. "Every life is worth saving." That sentence would follow her for years, because for the first time, she began to wonder whether the war she had fought was ever truly about life at all. But her quiet reckoning was only beginning. Something far stranger waited at the next stop, a place where prisoners learned, studied, and even debated under the same roof as their captors. The camp looked nothing like a prison. No guard towers this time, just wooden buildings painted white, a flag swaying lazily above them, and a small sign by the gate that read simply, "Education Center, Camp Shelby." Lucia stepped off the truck, half expecting another trick. But instead of soldiers with rifles, she saw men in khaki uniforms carrying notebooks, not weapons. A bell rang somewhere, and a group of prisoners, Italians like her, walked across the yard laughing. "School time," an American sergeant said. His tone wasn't cruel, almost amused. "You ladies will like this." Inside the main hall, long tables were covered in pencils, paper, and English books. On the chalkboard, written neatly in white letters, "Freedom begins with understanding." Lucia didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She looked around, scanning the faces of her comrades. Most were stunned. A tall American woman at the front introduced herself as Miss Reynolds. "Your English teacher," she smiled. "You'll learn quickly. Italians always do." The first lesson began with words like home, peace, tomorrow. Lucia repeated them softly, tasting each syllable as if it were forbidden fruit. She hadn't spoken words like that in months. Words that meant something beyond orders and fear. During breaks, the Americans offered newspapers, even novels. Mark Twain, Hemingway. One of the guards translated a line out loud. "Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear." Lucia didn't understand it all, but the rhythm of the sentence hit her somewhere deep. In the evenings, prisoners gathered to debate politics, philosophy, even poetry. They were encouraged to talk, to question. No one shouted, no one threatened. It was the strangest captivity imaginable, a captivity of the mind, gently undone. Julia turned to Lucia one night under the dim light of a kerosene lamp. "Maybe this is how they win," she said quietly. "Not with bombs, with books." Lucia didn't answer, but inside something was shifting. The slogans of her youth, honor, loyalty, sacrifice, were fading, replaced by something far more dangerous, doubt. She watched Miss Reynolds erase the board after class, the chalk dust catching in the light like snow. And for a fleeting second, Lucia thought she saw what victory really looked like, quiet, patient, and completely sure of itself. Yet beyond those peaceful walls, the war still raged. And soon, a letter from across the ocean would remind them that Italy itself was changing, that what they once fought for no longer even existed. The news came not from a general or a guard, but from a newspaper. It was a hot afternoon. The women sat beneath a shade tree, fanning themselves with folded worksheets from English class, when an American soldier approached with a stack of papers under his arm. He handed one to the teacher, nodded, and walked off without a word. Miss Reynolds hesitated before reading. Her eyes flicked over the page, then she sighed softly. "You should know," she said. "It's official." She laid the newspaper on the table. The headline, in thick black letters, screamed across the front page, "Mussolini falls. Italy signs." Armistice. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind stirred the pages. Somewhere far away, a train whistle echoed, long and mournful. Lucia stared at the words until they blurred. She felt something twist inside her chest, like an anchor snapping loose. Julia covered her mouth. "No, that can't be true." Another woman muttered, "It's propaganda. American lies." But the radio in the corner confirmed it. Mussolini captured, Italy surrendering, the regime collapsing. The teacher switched it off, perhaps out of mercy. The silence that followed was unbearable. Lucia rose, trembling. "So, who are we now?" she asked, no one in particular. "Prisoners? Refugees? Traitors?" No one answered. She remembered parades in Rome, banners fluttering, songs about glory and empire. She remembered her father's voice saying Italy would rise again, that their struggle was holy. Now, in this strange land, with the scent of pine and soap and freedom in the air, her country had simply stopped existing. That night, many of the women didn't eat. Some wept quietly. Others tore the insignias from their uniforms and buried them in the dirt behind the barracks. Julia sat in the dark, her hands clasped tight. "If the Duce is gone," she whispered, "then everything we did was for nothing." Lucia didn't reply. She couldn't. For the first time, she realized that the enemy hadn't destroyed them. The truth had. Later, as she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, the electric bulb above flickered softly. She thought of the American nurse, the hamburger, the book, the X-ray. Every kindness that had made her uncomfortable, every gesture that had quietly rewritten her idea of what strength meant. Maybe the war hadn't been about who was right. Maybe it had been about who could still be human. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, rhythmic, cleansing. And in the stillness, Lucia whispered a single sentence that would stay with her forever. They didn't win with weapons. They won with decency. But the Americans weren't done teaching yet. Something even more unsettling awaited the women the next morning, an invitation to join a church service side by side with their captors. Sunday morning arrived with a strange stillness. No drills, no orders. Just the smell of cut grass and distant bells. At breakfast, an announcement came through the loudspeaker, spoken slowly so even the prisoners could understand. "Voluntary Service Chapel, 9 o'clock. Lucia exchanged glances with the others. Voluntary. The word sounded suspicious. In their world, nothing had ever been voluntary. Yet curiosity, mixed with something softer, pushed them forward. The chapel was a small wooden building at the edge of the camp. White walls, open doors, sunlight streaming through windows cut with colored glass. A modest wooden cross stood above the altar. Inside, soldiers and prisoners sat together, their uniforms a patchwork of nations and defeat. No guards with rifles, no chain of command, just rows of men and women breathing the same air. A chaplain began to speak in slow, careful English, his voice low and steady. "We are all strangers here," he said, "but God recognizes every face." Lucia didn't understand every word, but she felt the tone, the gentleness, the absence of hate. He read from a book she had seen only once before, long ago in her mother's hands. Then, quietly, the singing began, a simple hymn. The Americans sang first, then hesitantly, the Italians joined. Voices that had shouted orders now trembled on words like grace and mercy. Lucia found herself staring at the stained glass window, an image of a shepherd carrying a lost lamb. The colors rippled across the pews, bathing everyone in fragments of light. Blue, gold, red. For the first time in years, she didn't feel part of an army, or a nation, or a cause. She felt like a person again. When the service ended, the chaplain didn't lecture. He simply walked down the aisle, shaking hands with each prisoner. "May peace find you," he said to Lucia. His palm was warm, unarmed. She nodded but couldn't speak. Outside, Julia wiped her eyes and muttered, almost ashamed, "They even pray like free people." Lucia looked back at the chapel door. Maybe that's why they are. As they walked away, she noticed the American flag hanging still against the pole. No wind, no movement, just the quiet shimmer of sunlight on red and white. For the first time, it didn't look like the flag of an enemy. It looked like something else, perhaps an idea. That afternoon, some of the women gathered under a tree. Someone began humming the hymn again. No one told her to stop. Lucia sat in silence, her mind no longer divided by sides or slogans. She thought, if compassion could cross a battlefield, maybe anything could. But the illusion of safety wouldn't last. Soon, trucks would arrive again, this time not to teach or comfort, but to take them somewhere new, somewhere colder, where mercy would once more be tested. The trucks came before sunrise. No warning, no explanation, just headlights cutting through the fog and the steady voice of an officer. "Pack your things." Lucia folded her blanket carefully, as if leaving behind a piece of herself. The chapel, the classrooms, even the smell of coffee, it all vanished into memory as the engines roared to life. Hours later, when the trucks stopped, they found themselves standing before a vast complex of steel and smoke. The sign read, Douglas Aircraft Company. It was a city within a city. Rows of hangars stretched into the distance, each one big enough to swallow a cathedral. Conveyor belts rattled. Cranes swung high above their heads. Women in coveralls, Americans, moved with quiet determination, riveting metal sheets, measuring wings, polishing glass canopies that glinted like sunlight trapped in steel. A supervisor explained through an interpreter, "You'll assist with assembly, nothing secret, just labor." Labor. They had done that before, but never like this. Inside the factory, the air hummed with electricity. Light bulbs burned day and night, as if the sun itself worked overtime for America. Lucia watched a woman her age operate a massive drill press, sparks flying from the metal like fireflies. No shouting, no overseers with whips or sticks, just precision, harmony, purpose. Julia whispered, "Even their noise is organized." Lucia nodded, staring at a finished fuselage being rolled out. Painted across its side, in red letters, "Made in 63 minutes." She couldn't believe it. An entire plane, built faster than a loaf of bread, could rise. Back home, a single engine part would take weeks, and that too under threat of bombs. During their lunch break, they were seated near American workers. The same food again, bread, milk, meat, and something else that made them uneasy, music. A band played near the cafeteria, trumpets and drums, keeping rhythm with the machinery. Lucia found herself tapping her foot unconsciously. The guard beside her noticed and smiled. "Glenn Miller," he said, "helps the day go faster." She didn't reply, but she watched him whistle between bites of his sandwich, this man who could build a bomber and hum a love song in the same breath. And it dawned on her. This was how America fought. Not with fanaticism, not with fear, but with faith in its own abundance. Every spark, every melody, every smile was part of the war effort, proof that joy itself could be weaponized. That night, Lucia lay on her bunk staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks beside the factory. The hum of generators never stopped. Even the silence worked here. She whispered, almost to herself. They build like they'll never lose. Julia turned toward her. Maybe that's why they don't. But beneath the rhythm of industry, another sound was growing. Rumors of the war turning, of Europe burning, of things they could barely imagine yet. And when the next train came, it would not take them deeper into America, but back toward a Europe they no longer recognized. The radio crackled before dawn. The women huddled around it, the factory floor still dark except for the faint glow of welding torches in the distance. The announcer's voice was calm, almost casual. Allied troops have landed in Italy. No one moved. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lucia felt her chest tighten. She waited for someone to explain, some mistake, some reassurance. But the broadcast continued. Salerno, Naples, Rome. Her homeland had become a battlefield. Julia clutched the edge of the table. "They're fighting us." An American foreman, overhearing, turned down the volume. "Not you," he said softly. "Not anymore." But his kindness only deepened the confusion. All morning, Lucia worked in silence. Every clang of metal felt like an echo from home. Her hands trembled as she passed rivets down the line. She imagined her brothers, one in uniform, one already gone, somewhere under that same sky, hearing the same explosions from the other side. At lunch, the guards didn't speak. Even the radio stayed off. Outside, the air smelled of oil and rain. Lucia sat under a half-built wing, staring at the droplets running across the metal skin like veins. She remembered the last time she saw Italy, olive trees burning in the distance, mothers whispering prayers to empty churches, men swearing loyalty to flags that meant less and less each day. And now, here she was, safe, fed, treated with dignity, while her own people starved in the ruins of cities once called eternal. Julia broke the silence. "Do you think they'll win?" Lucia looked at her. "Who? The Americans?" "No," Julia said quietly. "Us." Lucia didn't answer. She realized she didn't even know who us was anymore. That night, letters arrived from home, some real, some intercepted copies translated by censors. Lucia's mother wrote of bombs over Naples, of bread lines and churches turned to dust. She ended with a single sentence that struck deeper than any explosion. "If you are alive, be kind to whoever feeds you." Lucia read it again and again, until the ink blurred beneath her tears. The next morning, she walked past a half-assembled bomber, its nose painted with the name Liberty Bell. She ran her hand over the cold metal and whispered, "Maybe freedom isn't who you fight for. Maybe it's how you live after." But even as she spoke, new orders were already coming in. The war was moving closer to its end, and with it, a reckoning none of them were ready for. The announcement came on a quiet afternoon, when even the machines seemed to rest. A captain gathered them in the yard, his voice steady but heavy. "Italy has surrendered. The war's ending for you. You'll soon be repatriated." For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then whispers spread like a current, home, freedom, return. But the words didn't feel right anymore. Lucia's first instinct should have been joy. Yet as she looked around, at the dormitory walls covered with English notes, at the faces of guards who had learned to call them by name, something inside her sank. Home wasn't what it used to mean. Home had become an idea she could no longer picture. That night, the barracks filled with noise, laughter, tears, nervous excitement. Julia packed her clothes in silence, folding and refolding the same shirt. "Do you think Naples still stands?" she asked. Lucia didn't know. None of them did. They had heard rumors of bombings, of hunger, of entire towns erased. The country they were returning to wasn't the one they had left. It was just a name on the map, scarred and fading. In the cafeteria, the American workers brought them cake, real cake, with frosting and candles. "For your new beginning," one said. The gesture should have felt sweet. Instead, it stung. Lucia smiled politely, but when she tasted the sugar, it was too much, too bright, too good for a world that no longer made sense. Later that evening, she walked to the edge of the compound. The sun was setting behind the smokestacks, turning the air copper and gold. A train rumbled in the distance, the same kind of Pullman car that had once terrified her with its comfort. Now, it sounded like a farewell song. Julia joined her quietly. "I thought I'd be happy to leave," she said. Lucia nodded. "So did I." The next morning, their suitcases lined the dirt road. The American guards shook their hands, some awkwardly, some with real warmth. One of them pressed a small packet into Lucia's palm, a bar of soap, the same floral scent as her first shower months ago. "For home," he said. Lucia held it to her chest. She realized she no longer knew where home was. The trucks began to move. Through the dust, she caught her last glimpse of the factory, the chapel, the towers of light that never dimmed. It struck her then. This country, so vast and indifferent, had changed her not through force, but through decency. She whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, "May my country learn this someday." But the journey wasn't over yet, because what awaited them in Italy wasn't peace, but the quiet, unbearable question of who they had become. The ship that carried them home smelled of rust and salt and ghosts. No one spoke much on the voyage. The sea stretched endless, the same gray-blue that had swallowed years of their lives. The closer they came to Italy, the quieter everyone became, as if words might break the fragile illusion that home still existed. When the coast finally appeared, it didn't look like the Italy they remembered. The hills were scorched. The towns were colorless. Roofs caved in, church towers missing their bells. Smoke curled lazily from distant craters, and the air tasted of dust and old sorrow. At the dock, soldiers in new uniforms waited, not to embrace but to question. Names were checked, papers stamped. Lucia stood in line, clutching her suitcase like armor. A young officer frowned at her file. "Prisoner of war? In America?" She nodded. He raised an eyebrow. Must have been hard being treated so well. The words stung more than any insult. Behind her, someone whispered, "Collaborators." That word followed them all the way through customs, through the streets, through every gaze that lingered too long. Naples was unrecognizable, rubble where bakeries had stood, children playing beside cratered walls. Her mother's house was gone, bombed 6 months earlier. She found her only surviving brother living in the shell of an apartment, thin and bitter. When he saw her, his first words were not of joy, but of disbelief. "You ate meat?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "Sometimes." He turned away. "We ate rats." That night, Lucia lay awake on the cold floor, surrounded by silence broken only by the wind whistling through shattered windows. America felt like a dream now, a dangerous, shameful dream she couldn't speak of. Every kindness she had received there felt like a betrayal here. Yet when she washed her face in a tin basin, the scent of that American soap rose again, light, floral, clean. For a brief second, it filled the ruined room with something almost holy. Julia's voice came softly from the corner. "They think we were lucky." Lucia shook her head. "We were changed." She looked out at the horizon, where the sun was trying, weakly, to rise over the ruins. Everything she once believed about power, about pride, about enemies and victory had collapsed. But beneath that collapse, she felt something stubborn and quiet beginning to grow. Not faith in nations, not even hope, just a belief that decency, once seen, could never be unseen. As dawn spread across the broken rooftops, Lucia whispered to herself, "They can rebuild the walls, but I must rebuild my soul." And though the war had ended, her true battle, between memory and meaning, was only beginning. At first, the village children were the only ones who dared to knock on her door. Lucia had returned to the outskirts of Naples, to a small cottage she rebuilt from the rubble of her mother's home. The walls still smelled of smoke. The neighbors spoke her name in whispers. The woman who smiled at the Americans. At the market, they wouldn't meet her eyes. The priest gave sermons about pride, about betrayal, though he never said her name. Still, Lucia could feel it. Every pause, every glance, every silence weighed down with judgment. She spent her mornings scrubbing floors, her afternoons helping an old tailor mend torn uniforms left behind by the war. It was quiet work, safe work. But at night, she would take out a tattered English book the Americans had given her, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and trace each word by candlelight. The rhythm of the language comforted her, as if it carried warmth from a place she would never see again. One evening, a little boy from the neighborhood appeared at her door, barefoot, curious. "Signora," he said shyly, "is it true you can speak the language of the enemy?" Lucia smiled faintly. "Not enemy, just different." He frowned. "Will you teach me?" And so she did. At first it was only him, then 2 more, then 10. They sat on the floor, reciting words like home, peace, bread. She made chalk from crushed limestone and wrote on the wall itself, because she couldn't afford paper. "Every word you learn," she told them, "builds a door, and someday you'll need to open it." The neighbors called her strange. Some said she was poisoning the children's minds with foreign ideas. But one by one, even their sons began to come, drawn by curiosity, by warmth, by the way she made the ruined world feel a little less broken. One afternoon, an old soldier stopped outside her door. He watched the children repeat a phrase after her. "Thank you." He removed his hat, stepped closer, and said quietly, "My boy, he learned that word from you. It's the first time he's spoken to me since the war." Lucia nodded, eyes wet. "Then maybe there's hope for all of us." That night, she placed her last bar of American soap on the windowsill. The scent drifted into the dark, carrying memories of steam, of music, of light that never went out. In a country rebuilding from ashes, Lucia became something she never meant to be. A bridge. Not between nations, but between what had been lost and what could still be kind. Word of her lessons spread faster than she realized. By winter, children from 3 nearby villages were coming to her door, their voices echoing through the cold stone alleyways. They carried bits of charcoal, broken slates, and hope. Lucia never asked for money. She only asked that they wash their hands before touching the books. But not everyone saw kindness as innocence. One gray morning, 2 men arrived in long coats. Their boots were clean, too clean for peasants. One carried a folder stamped with the seal of the Comune di Napoli. "Signora Bianchi," the older one said. His tone wasn't rude, but it held the weight of authority. "Yes," she replied, her hands still dusted with chalk. "You are conducting lessons? In English?" Lucia nodded slowly. "Just for the children." He opened his folder. "Without permission, without registration, and," he paused, "without explanation." The second man stepped forward. "We've had complaints. People say you praise the Americans. That you," he searched for the word, "idolize them." Lucia smiled faintly, but her voice was steady. "I don't praise anyone. I teach words." The men exchanged glances. The older one sighed. "Words have power, Signora, too much power sometimes." He left her with a warning. Stop the classes, or the church would intervene. That evening, Lucia went to the chapel alone. The candles burned low, the saints staring down with patient eyes. She knelt, not to pray for forgiveness, but for courage. When she rose, she found Father Marco standing behind her. He had known her since childhood. "They say you're teaching children the enemy's tongue," he said quietly. Lucia met his gaze. "If compassion is the enemy's language, Father, then maybe we've been speaking the wrong one." He didn't answer right away. After a long silence, he said, "The world isn't ready for mercy that comes from defeat." "Then we must start small," she whispered. The next morning, she returned to her cottage and reopened the door. The children came, hesitant, eyes wide, afraid the soldiers might return. Lucia picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one word on the wall. "Kindness." "Repeat it," she said softly. They did, each voice trembling but growing stronger with every syllable. Through the cracked window, the scent of winter rain drifted in. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang again, slow, uncertain, as if the world itself were learning a new rhythm. And for the first time since the war, Lucia allowed herself to smile, not the smile of victory, but of survival with grace intact. Because she had finally understood. Empires fall, nations burn, but decency, once lit, never dies. By the time the next decade arrived, the war had faded into memory, but not its scars. Lucia's small school had become something larger, though she still called it the room. Children no longer sat on the floor. There were benches now, and books donated by travelers, and a battered radio that played news from a gentler world. The door was never locked. Sometimes returning soldiers stopped by, their faces older, their eyes quieter. They would stand at the threshold, listening to the sound of young voices reciting English verbs. Some smiled, some cried, all left different than they arrived. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Rome. The envelope bore the crest of a new government office. Reconstruction and Cultural Exchange. Inside, an invitation. "Signora Lucia Bianchi, you are requested to speak at the post-war symposium on reconciliation and renewal. Representatives from the Allied nations will attend." She read it twice, then laid it down. Her hands trembled. It had been more than 10 years since she last heard an American voice. The hall in Rome was grand and cold. The marble floors echoed with polished shoes and murmured translations. Lucia felt small among diplomats and officers in crisp suits. On the dais sat a handful of Americans, older now but unmistakable in posture and ease. One of them, a gray-haired man with a gentle face, caught her eye. For a moment she couldn't breathe. It was the doctor, the one with the silver hair and kind eyes who had shown her the X-ray of her heart. When her turn came, Lucia walked to the podium. Her notes shook in her hands, but her voice was steady. "I was a prisoner once," she began, "and I thought captivity meant losing your freedom. But I learned that freedom can begin anywhere, even in a camp, if someone chooses to treat you as human." A hush settled over the room. "I returned to a country that was broken. Not just the buildings, the spirit. So I taught children what I had seen. That kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not surrender. I taught them a language, yes, but really I was teaching them to rebuild trust." She paused, meeting the eyes of the Americans in the front row. "You showed us that power without cruelty is possible. I hope we've learned to do the same." The hall was silent, save for the faint hum of the translator's voice in the background. Then came the applause, not loud, but rising like a wave that refused to break. After the session, the American doctor approached her. His hair was thinner now, his eyes softer, but his smile was the same. "Miss Bianchi," he said, using the name he remembered. "I always wondered what became of you." Lucia laughed gently. "I became a teacher, doctor, of everything you taught me." He nodded, pressing something into her hand, a small vial of perfume, faintly floral. "Not shampoo," he said with a wink, "but close." Lucia held it close, eyes glistening. She realized then that history wasn't written only in treaties and battles. Sometimes it was written in gestures, a towel, a smile, a single bar of soap shared between enemies. As she stepped out into the Roman evening, the city lights flickered like distant memories of those first electric lamps across the American sky. And she thought, perhaps this is what victory truly looks like, not in conquest, but in the courage to be kind again. The years passed quietly, as if time itself had grown tired of shouting. Lucia's hair turned the color of the sea before a storm, and her hands, once strong enough to scrub floors and carry books, now trembled when she poured tea. The little schoolhouse still stood on the edge of the village, its walls patched with mismatched stones and ivy. Children still came, though they now called her Nonna Lucia, the village grandmother who taught the language of kindness. In the evenings, she sat by the window, watching the world drift toward another century. Radios spoke of new wars, new leaders, new promises. But to her, they all sounded like echoes of the same old story: ambition, pride, loss. And yet, something was different now. The children she once taught had grown. Some became teachers, others engineers, translators, doctors. They wrote her letters from cities she had never seen: London, Boston, San Francisco, each one beginning with the same words: "You showed me another world." She kept those letters in a small wooden box beside her bed, along with one bar of faded soap wrapped in cloth. The scent had weakened over the decades, but every now and then, when she opened the box, the air filled again with that same faint perfume, the scent of decency, of rebirth, of a shower that once washed away more than dirt. Sometimes she dreamed of the camp, not as a prison, but as a light. Steam rising in sunlight, laughter over tin plates, music crackling through distant radios. She would wake with tears on her face, not of sorrow, but of gratitude, for having seen both sides of what humanity could be. One afternoon, a young reporter from Naples arrived, notebook in hand. "Signora Lucia," he said gently, "is it true you were a prisoner in America?" She smiled. "Yes, though perhaps it was America that freed me." He frowned. "How can captivity be freedom?" Lucia looked out the window at the children playing beneath the olive trees. "Because it taught me what my country forgot, that kindness is the only power that never asks for victory." The reporter scribbled, unsure whether to believe her. Before leaving, he asked, "What should people remember about the war?" Lucia thought for a long time. Then she whispered, "Remember how easily we forgot to be human, and how quietly we can learn it again." That night, as the last light faded over the hills, Lucia lit a candle and placed it on the windowsill. She didn't pray. She didn't need to. Somewhere across the sea, she imagined that same light reflected in a window half a world away, perhaps in a home where someone still remembered a woman stepping trembling into a shower and realizing the war inside her was finally over. Lucia passed away in her sleep one spring morning. There was no pain, no struggle, just the sound of birds outside her window and the faint scent of flowers drifting through the open shutters. When the children found her, she was still sitting in her chair, a book open in her lap, her glasses sliding down her nose. The candle on the windowsill had burned itself out sometime during the night. Word spread through the village like a sigh. By noon, the schoolhouse was surrounded by people, old men who remembered her as the strange woman who taught English, mothers who had once been her students, and children clutching notebooks too heavy for their hands. They didn't cry loudly. They just stood there, silent, as if afraid to break the spell she had left behind. That evening, the mayor declared the old classroom a memorial. The villagers cleaned it together, scrubbing the floor, polishing the wooden desks. Someone found her small wooden box by the bedside. Inside, faded letters from her students abroad, a pressed flower, and the last fragment of that American soap. The scent was almost gone, but not entirely. Weeks later, a letter arrived from across the Atlantic. It was postmarked Washington, D.C. Inside was a short note. To the people of Naples, once, during a terrible war, we met a woman named Lucia Bianchi. She was a prisoner, but she showed us what freedom looked like. If possible, we would like to honor her, together. And so, that summer, they came. A small delegation of Americans, gray-haired veterans, nurses, even a historian from the War Department, arrived at the village. They brought photographs of the camp, copies of her old medical chart, and a vial of the same floral shampoo she had once held with trembling hands. The ceremony was simple. A few words, a prayer, a moment of silence. Then one of the Americans, a woman who had once been a nurse at Camp Shelby, stepped forward and placed a small bronze plaque on the wall of the classroom. It read, "Here lived Lucia Bianchi, 1917-1984. Captured in war, she chose compassion. Her lessons outlived every flag." When the sun began to set, a child, barely 8 years old, stood up and began to recite from one of Lucia's old notebooks. In halting English, she read aloud, "Every word you learn builds a door, and someday you'll need to open it." The crowd fell silent. Then, as if by instinct, the Americans and Italians began to sing the same hymn, the one Lucia had first heard in that camp chapel decades before. Their voices trembled at first, then rose together, stronger, until even the air itself seemed to shimmer. As the last note faded, a soft wind moved through the olive trees. The scent of soap, faint, floral, impossible, seemed to drift through the air again, and for a moment no one knew if it came from the hills, the sea, or from memory itself. Decades later, in a climate-controlled archive in Maryland, a young historian named Daniel Harper opened a box labeled POW, Italy, Camp Shelby, 1943-45. He had expected statistics, medical reports, supply manifests, dull fragments of bureaucracy. Instead, he found a file with a single name handwritten in fading ink, Bianchi, Lucia. Inside were yellowed papers, an intake card, a medical record, a typed note from a camp doctor. Patient cooperative, kind eyes, requests soap with floral scent. But tucked between the forms was something else, a letter, never sent. It was dated August 1944. Written in careful English, it read, "To whoever finds this, I am alive and learning your words. I think they are changing me. When I go home, I will teach them to children, so they will know the sound of kindness." Daniel sat back in his chair, the hum of the fluorescent lights fading into silence. He read the letter twice, then a third time. He could feel something old and human stir inside him, the recognition that history, at its truest, isn't about victories or defeats, but about what people decide to carry forward. He spent weeks tracing her story, digging through archives in Naples, church records, even faded newspaper clippings from the 1950s. He learned of the small school she had built, the plaque on its wall, the annual gatherings where children still sang the hymn she once heard as a prisoner. Eventually, he traveled to Italy. The schoolhouse still stood. Ivy curled around the doorway. The walls smelled faintly of chalk and sun. Inside, he found a young teacher organizing a lesson. When Daniel introduced himself, she smiled. "You're not the first American to come here," she said, "but you might be the first to understand why." She handed him a small photograph from a drawer, Lucia, standing in front of a blackboard, surrounded by children. On the board, written in neat chalk letters, were 2 words, "Be kind." Daniel placed the photograph on the desk and whispered, "She kept her promise." The teacher nodded. "And we keep hers." That evening, he walked to the edge of the village where the olive trees swayed in the warm wind. The air smelled faintly sweet, almost like flowers. He thought of that letter, of the unbroken thread between compassion given and compassion remembered, and he realized something simple yet immense. Mercy doesn't end with the hands that offer it. It travels quietly through time, finding new hearts to live in. When Daniel returned to Washington, he placed Lucia's letter in a display case at the National Museum of History. No medals, no weapons, just a few lines written by a woman who had once been an enemy and who had turned captivity into grace. Under the glass, a small plaque read, "Lucia Bianchi, proof that humanity survives even war." The auditorium lights dimmed as the projector flickered to life. On the screen appeared a sepia photograph. Lucia Bianchi standing before her blackboard, the word kindness chalked behind her in careful script. Professor Daniel Harper stepped up to the podium. His voice carried the calm reverence of a man who had spent his life among the ghosts of history. "This," he began, "is not the story of a battle. It's the story of what survived after the battles were over." The audience leaned forward, students, journalists, veterans, even diplomats from both sides of the Atlantic. The lecture was titled, "The Prisoner Who Taught Us Freedom." Daniel continued, "Lucia Bianchi was captured in 1943 and sent to a POW camp in Mississippi. She expected cruelty. Instead, she was met with soap, with bread, with dignity. She returned home a changed woman and quietly changed her country in return." On the screen, an image appeared of the plaque from her schoolhouse in Naples. Beneath it, the inscription, "Her lessons outlived every flag." He paused, letting the silence breathe. We often measure nations by what they build, ships, bombs, empires. But what if the truest measure is what they choose not to destroy? A veteran in the front row wiped his eyes. Daniel gestured toward the slide of Lucia's letter, the one she had written but never sent. She said, "I will teach children your words so they will know the sound of kindness." She didn't mean English. She meant mercy, spoken aloud. He clicked again. The final image filled the screen. The schoolhouse door, sunlit and half open, a candle flickering on the windowsill. "Lucia died in 1984, Daniel said softly, "but her classroom still stands, and every spring the children light a candle at her window. They call it La Luz de Lucia, Lucia's light." It's their way of reminding the world that compassion doesn't end with treaties. It lives on in the quiet acts no one writes about. He closed his notes and looked out at the audience. When we teach history, we often ask, who won? He let the question hang. But maybe the better question is, who stayed kind? The hall was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, gently, the applause began. Soft at first, then rising, filling the space like a tide. Later, as Daniel packed his notes, a young woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "Professor," she whispered, "my grandmother was one of those children Lucia taught. She used to say, 'We learned English, yes, but really we learned forgiveness.'" Daniel smiled, the old letter still folded in his pocket. "Then Lucia's light still burns," he said. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the cherry trees. For a moment, he thought he caught a faint, familiar scent, floral, gentle, impossible, and he realized that some stories never end. They just keep breathing quietly through those who choose to remember. The final image fades in, steam, light, silence. A woman stands beneath a shower head, hands trembling as warm water falls across her face. The scene is grainy, black and white, as if drawn from memory. Lucia, the first day of her captivity. The first day she learned that mercy could feel like confusion. But slowly, the color seeps in. The gray turns to silver, then to gold. The water becomes sunlight. The sound of it dissolves into the laughter of children, echoing softly, impossibly, across time. The narrator's voice returns, calm and reflective. When she stepped into that shower, Lucia thought she was being humiliated. Instead, she was being reborn. In the smallest act of decency, she saw the power that outlives every empire, the power to choose grace when the world demands vengeance. The camera pans across generations. The camp, the schoolhouse, the candle, the museum. Faces change, uniforms disappear, but the gestures remain. A hand offering bread, a teacher's smile, a student's first word in a new language. And somewhere, faint but clear, the sound of a hymn drifts through the years. The final shot returns to that letter under glass in the museum. The ink faded, the paper yellowed, but the words still legible. When I go home, I will teach them your words, so they will know the sound of kindness. The narrator whispers, "She did, and we still hear it." Outside the museum, the world hums with quiet modern life. Cars, laughter, screens. But through an open window, sunlight spills in, illuminating the letter until the page glows softly, almost alive. The music swells, a low, human choir, neither triumphant nor sad, just full. Fade to black. Then, one final line appears on screen. In war, humanity is the first casualty. In mercy, it is reborn. Silence. Then a breath. Then nothing but the sound of wind, gentle, eternal, as if history itself were exhaling.